Every empire is born in a whisper and dies in a roar. That is not a metaphor, that is a pattern, a rhythm so consistent across human civilization that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And nowhere in all of recorded history does that rhythm play out with more brutal, more devastating, more absolute clarity than in what happened to Iran in the 13th century. We are not talking about a war. We are not talking about a conquest. We are talking about an extinction event for human civilization, a moment so catastrophic that historians still struggle to find the language for it, a moment that erased cities the way a hand erases chalk from a board, clean, complete, final. So before we go anywhere, before we build anything, ask yourself one question. If everything you knew, your city, your language, your libraries, your markets, your neighbors, your entire world, if all of it could be gone within a single season, what would that feel like? What would it sound like? What would the air smell like the morning after? That is not a hypothetical. For millions of people living across the Iranian plateau in the year 1219, that question had a very real and very terrible answer. The year is 1219. The place is Samarkand, though we could just as easily begin in Nishapur or Merv or Bukhara or any of the great jeweled cities that stretched across the Eastern Islamic world like pearls on a trade route. The population of the greater Khwarezmian Empire, the dominant Persian-speaking civilization of the era, sits somewhere between 30 and 40 million people. These are not estimates born from guesswork. These are figures reconstructed from tax records, agricultural surveys, and archaeological density studies. 30 to 40 million people, organized, literate, thriving. Now imagine you are standing at the edge of a bazaar in Nishapur on a morning in early autumn. The air is thick with the smell of cardamom and roasting lamb. Somewhere behind you, a coppersmith is hammering out a rhythm that has not changed in 300 years. The sound bounces off stone walls that were old before your grandfather was born. The street beneath your feet is worn smooth by 10 centuries of commerce. Merchants are arguing in Persian, in Arabic, in Turkic, in the trade dialects that have no clean name because they belong to everyone and no one. A boy is selling pomegranates from a wooden cart. A scholar is walking with a stack of manuscripts pressed against his chest, navigating the crowd with the careful focus of someone carrying something irreplaceable. Because he is. This is the world before the storm. And the tragedy of this moment, the deep, aching tragedy, is that almost no one in this bazaar knows the storm is coming. Not yet. You would not know it either. You are living through what feels like a golden age. The Silk Road is alive. Caravans move between China and the Mediterranean with a regularity that modern shipping companies might envy. The cities of the Iranian plateau are not merely rest stops on a trade route, they are intellectual capitals. Nishapur is producing poets and mathematicians. Merv, with its 4 distinct libraries, is arguably the largest city in the world at this moment. Samarkand is a center of astronomical observation, paper production, and theological debate. This is a civilization at its peak, self-assured, layered, complex. And that complexity is, in a strange and terrible way, part of what makes it so vulnerable. To understand what is about to happen, you need to understand what was happening roughly 4,000 kilometers to the northeast on the steppes of Mongolia. Because the destruction of Iranian civilization does not begin with a general giving an order. It begins with something much older, much simpler, a man. His name, by the time history records him fully, is Genghis Khan, born sometime around 1162, possibly in a felt tent on the banks of the Onan River. He is a child of extraordinary violence and extraordinary vision in roughly equal measure. His father was poisoned when he was 9. He spent years as a slave.
He clawed his way back through a world that had every reason to destroy him, and instead found himself, by 1206, recognized at the Great Kurultai on the Mongolian plateau as the universal ruler, the Khan of Khans of a unified Mongol nation. What he had done was not simply military, it was organizational. The Mongols, before Genghis, were fragmented, tribal, perpetually at war with each other. He unified them through a combination of absolute loyalty oaths, merit-based military promotion, and a willingness to absorb and elevate anyone from any background who demonstrated usefulness. His generals were not always Mongol by blood. His administrators were often Chinese or Persian or Uyghur. He built an empire of function, not of ethnicity, and that made it ferociously effective.
The Mongol military system by 1219 is something that modern military historians study with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. The decennial organization, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, created a chain of command that could operate across vast distances without confusion. The cavalry were not simply horsemen, they were mobile artillery, capable of covering up to 130 kilometers in a single day. They carried dried meat and blood as rations, sleeping in the saddle when necessary. They trained in coordinated feigned retreats, drawing enemy formations out of defensive positions before wheeling and destroying them. They used psychological warfare as deliberately as they used arrows. The reputation of total destruction, which they cultivated consciously and carefully, was itself a weapon. A city that surrendered immediately might be spared. A city that resisted would be made an example of. And those examples were documented and spread deliberately so that the next city would think very carefully before raising its walls. This is the machine that is now pointed at Iran. The trigger is almost mundane in the context of what follows. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan arrives at the city of Otrar on the eastern border of the Khwarezmian Empire. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, accuses the merchants of being spies and has them executed. Some accounts say 450 people were killed, others say 500. The exact number matters less than what happens next. Genghis Khan sends a diplomatic envoy to Shah Muhammad II, the ruler of the Khwarezmian Empire, demanding justice and the execution of the governor. Muhammad executes the envoys instead. Some accounts say he burned the beard of the lead ambassador, which in the custom of the steppe was among the most profound insults imaginable. Others say he simply had them killed. Either way, the die is cast, and what is set in motion is not a punitive expedition, it is an apocalypse. Now picture yourself back in Nishapur. The year is now 1221. 2 years have passed since the Mongols crossed the Jaxartes River and began what they themselves described as their Western campaign. You have heard things. Rumors at first, stories carried by exhausted refugees who arrived looking like they had seen the world end. Bukhara has fallen. Samarkand, the greatest city in the east, has fallen. The Shah himself is fleeing across his own empire, hunted by a Mongol force sent specifically to kill him. A manhunt that would chase him all the way to a small island in the Caspian Sea, where he dies, alone, reportedly wrapped in a borrowed shirt because he has nothing left.
The rumors reaching Nishapur are fragmentary, but consistent. The Mongols do not simply conquer, they erase. Bukhara, a city of somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people, was sacked so completely that what the Mongols did not take, they burned. The Great Friday Mosque was used to stable horses. The scholars, the merchants, the craftsmen who could be useful were separated from the rest. The rest were killed. Genghis Khan reportedly stood in the courtyard of the mosque and told the survivors that he was the punishment of God, and that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him. You do not know how much of this to believe. Surely it is exaggerated. Surely a civilization this old, this dense, this interconnected cannot simply cease to exist.
Surely something this vast cannot be this fragile. It can. Nishapur falls in April of 1221. The Mongol commander at the time is Tugru, but the campaign is driven by a personal grief that makes it especially relentless. Tokuchar, a son-in-law of Genghis Khan, had been killed by an arrow during an earlier siege of the city. The Mongol principle of revenge within the Khan family was absolute. The orders, by multiple accounts, were that nothing living should remain, not a cat, not a dog. The city was razed, the population was massacred. Skulls were built into pyramids, a practice the Mongols used as both a record of the scale of their victory and a warning to anyone approaching. Contemporary accounts describe the skull pyramids outside Nishapur as visible from a great distance. Contemporary accounts also describe the silence after, when there was nothing left to burn and no one left to scream. The great library at Merv, which held what scholars believe was one of the largest collections of manuscripts in the Islamic world, was destroyed when the city fell. We do not know exactly what was lost. That is the nature of this kind of destruction. You do not get an inventory of what was erased. You only know that the people who could have told you are gone. Merv, at the time of its fall, may have had a population of somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people. The range in that estimate reflects how little physical evidence survived for archaeologists to work with. The Persian historian Juziani, writing in the decades after, records that one survivor who returned to the ruins counted 1,300,000 bodies. Modern historians debate the precision of that figure. They do not debate its emotional truth.
And this is the shadow narrative, the part of history that the grand military maps and the names of conquering generals tend to obscure. Because for every name we remember, Genghis, Tolui, Jebe, Subutai, there are 10 million names we will never know. The coppersmith in Nishapur, the scholar carrying his manuscripts, the boy with the pomegranate cart. They do not have monuments, they do not have chronicles, they have only the silence that replaced the sound of their lives. There were those who fled into the mountains of what is now Afghanistan and Tajikistan, into the narrowest valleys where horses could not easily follow. There were those who hid in the desert, surviving on almost nothing. There were those who converted on the spot to whatever identity seemed most likely to spare them, performing the Mongol customs, swearing allegiance to names they could barely pronounce. Survival in this era required a kind of moral improvisation that history rarely celebrates, but that represents, in its own way, an astonishing act of human will. The libraries that could be moved were moved. Manuscript collections were carried out of cities in the hours before the walls fell, wrapped in oilcloth and loaded onto donkeys, heading south, heading west, heading anywhere that was not here. Some of those manuscripts survived. A handful of the intellectual tradition of the Eastern Islamic world was preserved in exactly this way. Individual human beings making individual decisions, carrying individual books into the dark. But we need to stop for a moment because there is a question that history often glosses over in the rush to describe the violence. Why? Not why did Genghis Khan invade? The diplomatic incident at Otrar gives us the proximate cause. But why did it go this far? Why was the destruction so total? Why did the greatest cities of the medieval world simply cease to exist? The answer is uncomfortable, and it is multi-layered. Part of it is military logic. The Mongol cavalry system required mobility above all else. Leaving functioning hostile cities behind your supply lines created a vulnerability they could not afford. Total destruction was, from a purely strategic standpoint, the most efficient solution. A city that no longer existed could not organize a counterattack. Part of it is psychological warfare deliberately scaled.
The reputation of the Mongols as absolute destroyers was a tool. It forced cities into impossible choices: surrender and possibly survive, resist and certainly die. The tool only worked if the threat was credible, and it only remained credible if the examples were extreme enough to be unforgettable. Part of it is organizational. The Mongol forces were operating at the edge of their logistical range. They could not occupy and administer vast territories in the same campaign that required them to keep moving. Destruction was, in a terrible way, administratively simpler than occupation during the initial phase of the campaign. But there is something else, something that sits in the space between military logic and human nature. The Mongols came from a world of movement. The cities of Iran, with their walls and their markets and their libraries and their complexity, represented everything that was the opposite of that world. There is evidence, in the chronicles of the period, of a genuine ideological hostility to settled civilization among some Mongol commanders. The idea that agricultural land could be more useful as pasture for horses, that cities were in a fundamental sense unnecessary, that the nomadic way of life was superior, this was not universally held among the Mongols, but it was present. And in the absence of strong administrative incentives to preserve, the default leaned toward destruction. Genghis Khan himself died in 1227, before the full conquest of the Iranian world was complete, but the campaigns continued under his sons and grandsons. Hulagu Khan, a grandson, completed the Western campaign with the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258, killing the Caliph, the symbolic head of the Sunni Muslim world, and ending a dynasty that had lasted 5 centuries. Baghdad, which may have had a population of up to 1 million people, was sacked for nearly 2 weeks. The Tigris River, by several accounts, ran black with the ink of the manuscripts thrown into it, and red with the blood of those who died alongside them. The scale of what was lost demographically across the Iranian plateau between 1219 and 1260 is one of the most debated and most devastating figures in historical demography. Some scholars estimate that the population of Iran fell by as much as 75%. Others put the figure lower, perhaps 50 or 60%. But even the most conservative estimates describe a demographic catastrophe of a scale that would not be seen again in history until the plagues of the 14th century. And even those comparisons feel inadequate when you consider that the death in Iran was concentrated within a much shorter period. Let us be specific. Merv, which in the years before the invasion was one of the largest cities on Earth, remained effectively uninhabited for decades after its fall. Nishapur, which had been a center of intellectual and commercial life for centuries, was rebuilt but never fully recovered its pre-invasion scale. Urgench, the capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, was so thoroughly destroyed that when Marco Polo passed through the region later in the 13th century, he described a landscape of ruins. The agricultural infrastructure of Khorasan, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the medieval world, was systematically dismantled. The underground irrigation channels, the qanats, which had taken generations to build and which made the cities of the Iranian plateau possible in a landscape that would otherwise be inhospitable, were filled in or destroyed. Without water, the land reverted to desert. Without the land, the remaining population could not sustain itself. The destruction of the infrastructure was, in the long term, almost as devastating as the immediate violence.
And yet, here is the thing about human beings that history keeps trying to tell us and that we keep being surprised by. They do not simply end. Even in the aftermath of something this absolute, even in the rubble of civilizations that had taken 1,000 years to build, people found ways to continue. Not easily, not cleanly, not without enormous cost, but they continued. Within a generation, something remarkable began to happen. The Mongol rulers of Iran, known as the Ilkhanate, began to change. Hulagur himself, despite being the conqueror of Baghdad, had Buddhist and Nestorian Christian wives and showed genuine intellectual curiosity. His court in Maraga, in what is now northwestern Iran, became a center of astronomical research. The Maraga Observatory, built in 1259, brought together astronomers from across the Islamic world, from China, from Byzantium. The work done there would eventually influence Copernicus in the 16th century. The conquerors, in absorbing the civilization they had tried to destroy, were themselves absorbed by it. By the early 14th century, the Ilkhan rulers of Iran had converted to Islam. They were commissioning Persian poetry. They were rebuilding cities. They were patronizing art forms, particularly the Persian miniature tradition, that would reach heights of extraordinary beauty precisely because they were produced under Mongol patronage with access to Chinese artistic techniques carried west along the very trade routes the Mongols had unified and reopened. The Mongol Empire, for all its catastrophic violence, did create the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability across a vast swath of Eurasia that allowed trade and cultural exchange on a scale not seen before. The Silk Road functioned during this period with a safety and an efficiency that travelers remarked upon. Ibn Battuta could move from Morocco to China within a single lifetime. Marco Polo could travel from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan and return to tell the story. Information, technology, and goods moved in both directions with unprecedented freedom. But let us not allow the silver lining to obscure the storm cloud. The Persian language survived the Mongol invasion not because the Mongols failed to destroy it, but because enough people survived to keep speaking it, because enough manuscripts were carried to safety by enough desperate individuals, because enough scholars fled far enough and returned late enough to find the embers still warm. The survival of Persian literary culture after the Mongol invasion is not a testament to the tolerance of the conquerors. It is a testament to the stubbornness of the conquered. Rumi, whose poetry today is read across the entire world, whose words have been translated into dozens of languages, and who sits comfortably on the bestseller lists of the 21st century, was born in Bulk, a city that would fall to the Mongols within his lifetime. His family fled west before the conquest reached them. He eventually settled in Konya, in Anatolia, far enough from the front lines to survive, close enough to the catastrophe to feel its weight in everything he wrote. The spirituality that permeates his work, the aching for unity, the meditation on loss and longing, and the presence of the divine in a broken world is not incidental to the historical moment in which he lived. It is inseparable from it. This is the present-day link that matters most. When you read Rumi in a coffee shop in London or New York, you are reading a man shaped by a refugee experience, born from the single most destructive event in the history of Islamic civilization. The spiritual hunger in his poetry is the hunger of a world that has lost almost everything and is trying to find a reason to continue. That context does not diminish the beauty of the poetry, it makes it more extraordinary. Because beauty produced in the ruins of catastrophe carries a weight that beauty produced in comfort and safety simply cannot match. The archaeological sites of Merv, now in modern Turkmenistan, stretch across 28 kilometers of desert. The mud-brick ruins of buildings that were once libraries, palaces, mosques, and markets extend to the horizon in every direction. There are almost no visitors. The wind moves through them in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe without reaching for words that feel overwrought. You stand there and you understand that this silence is not natural. It was made, deliberately, by human beings who decided that what had been built here was less valuable than what could be taken from here. And then you walk back to your car and drive back to the nearest city, and you pass through landscapes that have been continuously inhabited for the 6 or 7 centuries since the conquest, and you realize that the story did not end in those ruins. The people who survived rebuilt, slowly, imperfectly, without all the pieces, the way you might try to reconstruct a shattered mosaic, knowing that some of the tiles are gone forever. The picture is different, the colors are changed, but something remains. Something was carried through. The final realization, if there is one, is not about the Mongols. It is not about Genghis Khan or Hulagu or the specific military innovations that made their campaign so devastating. The final realization is about what human civilization actually is. We tend to think of it as a structure, something solid, something that once built simply stands. But the Mongol invasion reveals that civilization is not a structure at all. It is a practice. It is a set of habits and memories and conversations and manuscripts passed from one hand to another in the dark. It is people deciding, even in the face of absolute destruction, that the thing they are carrying is worth carrying, that the language they are speaking is worth speaking, that the poems they have memorized are worth remembering. It is that decision, made by individuals under impossible pressure, that determines whether anything survives. Every empire is born in a whisper and dies in a roar. But in the silence that follows the roar, if you are very quiet, if you listen with the kind of attention that history requires of us, you can still hear the whisper of what came before. You can hear it in the Persian spoken today across Iran and Afghanistan and Tajikistan. You can hear it in the verses of Rumi and Hafez. You can hear it in the architecture of cities that were rebuilt on the bones of cities that were burned. You can hear it in the work of historians and archaeologists who go back to those ruins, not to mourn, but to listen. This essay was built from a wide range of historical sources, including the chronicles of Juvayni and Juzjani, who wrote within decades of the events described, the demographic analyses of scholars including David Morgan and Timothy May, the archaeological surveys of Merv conducted by the joint Turkmenistan and British teams across the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and the ongoing scholarly conversation about the long-term environmental and demographic impact of the Mongol invasions on the Iranian plateau. The goal was always the same, not to sensationalize, but to witness, to give the silence a shape, to make the weight of what happened in the 13th century feel for just a moment like the weight it actually was. Now, one question before we go. If the Mongols destroyed the Islamic world with such totality, how did the Ottoman Empire rise from those same ashes just 2 centuries later? Where did that phoenix come from? Leave your answer below, because the next chapter of this story is one of the most improbable recoveries in the history of human civilization. And we are just getting started.